Hello, Dr. Ron England here, and this is Advanced JavaScript and jQuery. We're going to do dynamic form generation here, and this will probably be a part one since it's going to probably take a little bit more to go through this. So let me show you what actually I mean by dynamic forms generation. What we have here is what I'm going to call a quick advisor, but basically what it is it's a dynamic form. It's got a little bit of CSS here for formatting, but the concept is that if I take this class, these are classes and these are semesters that I can take classes. If I decide I'm going to take this class in the fall of 2019, which is when I'm shooting the video, or actually summer, and I click that, you notice that these other guys, these other checkboxes turn green. Well, that's not necessarily dynamic form generation. That's actually dynamically changing the state of the individual forms. And I can then turn around and I can check other ones. And what's going to happen is dynamically everything is going to change. And the logic here is a business logic based on taking classes, taking the prerequisites for other classes. So, for example, if I were to take trigonometry and pre-calculus, I would be able to then be able to take over here calculus. Well, that's all fine and good, but the entire concept here that I'm going to show you is the separation of business logic and the actual operation of the form. Because what I can do if I can separate the business logic out is I can take other situations for different majors and I can apply the business logic but still use the same code for everything else. There's also some niceties that I threw in here, like fill out form, click for printable schedule. It's going to go in and it's going to show you what time you can take. And if I don't know if you noticed, but right here when I clicked this next one, that 9 hours required and 9 hours completed showed up there. And I can even go all the way down to the bottom here and you can say, here's how many hours I'm actually taking in any given semester based on what I've clicked. So that is, again, all dynamic. Now, to show you how this works, I'm doing this at JS Fiddle, wonderful tool, and I'm going to jump back to the actual code of the JS Fiddle. And as I do that, I'm going to, in JS Fiddle, I've got set up into 4 quadrants. One is my HTML, the other one is my JavaScript, one is my CSS, and then the last one is going to be the actual what shows up on the screen. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to move this around so you can really see the JavaScript, which is what's going to be the most interesting thing for you. The HTML is not necessarily that tremendously interesting in that only thing I've got in HTML is the button that was to fill out the form, and if you look at the HTML, there's just really not a lot there because everything else is dynamically generated. I'm using JQuery, and I'm not using anything other than JQuery. I'm not using any of the other, the JQuery tools. I'm just using JQuery straight. So the first thing in JQuery is that document ready function, and what I've done is I've created a list of the classes. I've checked all the classes, and I set all the checkboxes, which what it does is it just goes through and looks at the state of the checkboxes. But now let's look at how I'm going to separate out this business logic. So what I did here is I've got a number of arrays. One of the arrays that I've got is going to be an array called semesters. And this is just what you saw at the top, the semesters, fall 2019 through summer 2021. There were 6 of them. And in those semesters, those were each corresponding to a columns in the table that I have generated. And if you looked at it, remember it was a table, and each column was a semester, except for the first column, which is column 0, was the actual courses themselves. Then I have this thing called course groups, and I think what I'll do, since that semesters is pretty straightforward, when I talk about course groups, I'm going to go back and I'm going to show it to you again, just because it kind of makes it easier to keep track of what I'm doing here. So down here, I've got this thing called communications-English. And that is a course group. It's a group of courses that's logically put together. The logic here can be anything. It can be courses in a curriculum that fall into natural groups, but it could be anything that falls into a group. So in this case, it's course groups. And as you can see, as I click on, now if I click in these boxes, it basically, my logic is that these courses were taken prior to any one of these semesters. So that's kind of an interesting logic that I can do there. But the concept should be something that most people understand because most people have been to school and understand the concept of taking courses in a given semester. So now let's go back to that JavaScript here that we were looking at. Now looking at that JavaScript, and if you'll notice, what I'm really saying is this JavaScript here is basically something that's going to run, and all it does is call a number of functions that dynamically generate that. Everything on that screen is dynamically generated. And then my logic is I've got course groups with 3 properties: title, courses, and hours. And if you look at this, the title is the title that you saw. Courses is a array of courses which I'm giving by name: ENC 1101, ENC 1102, SPC 2608, and RTV 2300, which make up that group. And I've got a number of course groups. You can see there's quite a few of them. Now, the courses themselves, ENC 1101, are down here in another array called course list, which is another array of objects, where I've got the course, which is its name, ENC 1101, and that does need to match the course up here in the course list. And it's got a name. I'm using the logic here that the property taken is 99 if you have not taken, and if you have taken it, it's going to be somewhere between 1 and 6, 7, 8, 9. It doesn't matter because I made it flexible, which is the semester that you took it, which basically is going to correspond with the column of that semester. And then I actually put this little thing here, offering, because what I can do is I can block out offerings of the course if it's not going to be offered in a specific semester. It gives me a little bit more flexibility and logic. Remember, what I'm teaching you to do here is take this information and dynamically generate stuff. So let's look at how that dynamic generation goes. Now, I've got a lot of courses in here, so I'm going to have to scroll through all of them to get to some of that actual JavaScript that's down at the bottom here. And see, yes, I did enter all these. So the first function that we're going to see here is create list available. Create list available is a function that takes the course groups, and in each course group, it creates a number of rows for all of the courses in the group. Remember, each group was a logical grouping of courses, and so that really doesn't do a whole lot. And then at the very bottom, I create a row at the bottom where I can actually count up the hours of the rows. But let's look at exactly how this next step occurs, because it's kind of interesting. You've got a lot going on here. I'm going to go ahead and pull this down so you can see a little bit more here. So I've got this, and I'll pull it over a little bit so you can actually get it here. Now, create group row. Now, before you start building something, you need to come up with, how am I going to keep track of everything that's on the page? Well, since I've got things in a table, I'm going to keep track of it by rows and columns. It's pretty straightforward, but the columns will be simple. The first column will be 0, then the next 6 columns are 1 through 6. The rows I'm going to have correspond with the index of the courses in the array of courses, which is this global variable course list, which contains these objects which have these different properties, which basically is completely written in JSON. Some of the different objects, some of the different properties will be arrays, and some of the different properties will be just simple string values. Some of them are numeric, or integers. But let's go look and see how this works. So I said, okay, you know what? I'm going to create a row in the table. The first thing I want to do, and this is a group row, so the first thing I want to do is put up a group header. And the group header, I've got to give it an index that basically the index is going to be the ID that I use for it. So in this case, I'm going to use gr as the group underscore, and then the index that goes with it. And in this case, it's going to be 0 for the first one, underscore 0 for the first column. So for the first group, it's 0. Next column, it's 0. Why? That's an easy way to do it. So now I can keep track of all my groups. My groups are numbered 0 through whatever number of groups I've got, and it doesn't matter how many there are because each of the groups is an array, and I can always keep track of how many groups are in the array themselves. Then what I'll do is I have up here in HTML a table that has a name to it, and what I'll do is I'll append a row. This is the JQuery. I use the selector to get the table. to the body, and I append a row. Then that row's got the ID of group index, and then what I do is I append in a table, a data cell, and that data cell's got the index _0 for the first one, and for the ones that come after that, I'm just going to number them from 1 to however many columns I've got, which is going to be based on how many semesters I want to stick in, how many columns I want to do. And notice what I did was I used the selector to get the table and the body. Then I appended a row and gave it an ID. Then I took the row and I appended a cell. And the cell's going to have an ID. It's going to have some text, and it's going to have a class associated with it. And remember, the class associated with it can be over here defined in CSS. I'm not going to go through the CSS that I use because pretty much I'm sure you can Google CSS and get whatever appearance you want. You saw the appearance that I used with the colors and the green and the blue, but it doesn't matter because you can easily do those however you want to. The important thing here is that I am dynamically generating these rows. If you look at how I do this, I take the table that I've got up defined in HTML, I define a row. I take the row that I've now defined with JQuery, and I defined a table data. And I'm going to create the first one, which is going to be index 0, will be the classes. And then however many semesters I've got, I'm going to create a column for each of those with its TD that goes with that. So I've now got, and then I put in the text, and it's got a class that goes with it. So once I've done that, I can now say, you know what? I want to actually fill in the rows with checkboxes. Now here's where you're going to have to get kind of interesting because I need those checkboxes to have an index that I can use to reference the checkbox. I need to know when that checkbox is actually created, but I also need to know how to get to it. So let's look at the course row. This is where I'm actually putting in a checkbox. And what I've done is the very first one I have a function called right here, add taken checkbox. And then for the next ones beyond and that's going to be indexed at 0. Then for the next ones, I've got add semester checkbox. I want you to look at my code. So for each of the table rows that I've created, I've now gone ahead and I've put in this row using my number scheme and then adding in the checkboxes. So now I can go and say, you know what, I'm not going to do create out. Okay, so now I can say, what does the add taken checkbox look like? Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead, and this was a little tricky because I had to create this input inside of a label with a span to get the formatting that I wanted. But the only one thing I think I've got here that's actually key, very key to this, well, there's two things. One is I'm going to put the checkbox in a container. That's the first thing that I did, and the container is inside the row that it's going to live inside of. Okay. That means I'm appending to con, which is the container, which you see right there, which was passed over to the add taken checkbox. The con, the container, was passed over. So that when I build the entire thing, it's appending it into the con, which is the container. That concept in jQuery is very important. I can append things inside of a container. Now, now I'm giving that object that I put inside of that container a variable name so that I can append to it. So in other words, I'm going to append stuff into that container. So like right here, this PR, which was a div, which is going to have this little text of prerequisites, I can now append it to L, which what that does is it gives me the behavior right here where if I hover, it gives me the prerequisites because I simply was able to define what's going to happen with the hover by the class, which is the CSS class that goes with it. And that gives you that text that's going to go there. So the two things that are really important, though, as you actually put this in there are, one, the ID of the input, and two, the actual action that's going to take when you click on that. Notice the syntax. This is jQuery. I'm creating an input. It is a checkbox. It has a class, it has an ID, but it also has an event, the click, and when you click on it, it's going to have click taken course with the event target ID. So in other words, I've got the ID of the checkbox passed over to a function called click taken course, and now I can respond to clicks with the business logic. The business logic, however, is going to be defined, as we recall, by what I've got up here in the JSON. So as long as that JSON matches that business logic, and what's that business logic going to do? It's going to say, let's check to see if let's look at everything that's in there and see if you take this course, what other courses use it as a prerequisite, and let's go ahead and enable those courses. This is part one. I want to get you into this concept of dynamically creating objects and interface elements with jQuery, because when I can do that, all I've got to do is to find the JSON that defines the interface, and all of the code will just basically magically work, well, magically because you programmed it to work with the business logic, which is encoded in that JSON. There is a lot of code in here. Yes, it's very complex, but it isn't that complex that you can't work your way through it. Anyway, that is part one. I will be continuing with part two soon.